Hey guys, we are going to continue reading today Woods Runner by Gary Paulson. So last time we just finished chapter 2 and 3, which concluded part 1 called Green. Now it's time for part 2, Red. War, 1776. We're going to start this off by reading another fact sheet that was included. This one is on weapons. A single rifle, something every frontier family needed, something that was an absolute necessity, might take a year or more, and a year's wages, to get from one of the rare gunsmiths located perhaps a mile away. This was the only weapon many of the rebels carried into battle against the British. The firearm issued to the British Army was called the Brown Bess musket. It was a smoothbore and fired a round of .75 caliber, approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter, with a black powder charge ignited by flint. That pushed a ball at 700 or 800 feet per second when it left the muzzle. Modern rifles send the bullet out just over 3,000 feet per second. So 700 or 800 feet is a lot for back then, but barely anything today. Because a round ball fired from a smooth bore is so pitifully inaccurate, the ball bounces off the side of the bore as it progresses down the barrel. The Brown Bess was really only good for about 50 yards. The ball would vary in flight so widely that it was common for a soldier to aim at one man and hit another man 4 feet to the left or right. With the Brown Bess, each British soldier was issued a bayonet, nearly 3 feet long, that twist-locked to the end of the barrel and turned the empty weapon into a kind of attacking spike. Along with personal weapons, the British Army employed artillery, small field cannons, which fired plain round balls, exploding shells, and grape shots. Scores of round musket balls packed down the bore to make the cannon into something like a giant shotgun. Ooh! So I guess that's what a grape shot is. It's like a bunch of tiny balls shooting out of it at once instead of one giant ball. A grape shot was so viciously effective against columns of marching men that its destruction would not be duplicated until the use of the rapid-fire machine gun in the First World War. Wow. So this was used in the Revolutionary War, the very first war Americans ever fought in. And World War came years, like several decades later. So to know that they had something as effective as a machine gun during the Revolutionary War by using a cannon and musket shots, oof. Can you imagine? Whole ranks of attacking men could be torn to pieces in a single shot of the grape shot. The musket ball passing through a man after man, ripping them apart. Gruesome. Chapter 4. Now, we just left Samuel in chapter 3. He was hunting. He was about 8 miles, an hour and a half away from his home when he saw a smokestack, and he used his wildlife instincts to determine that the smokestack was not just a rubbish pile being burnt or scrap wood, but something bigger and more deadlier. So he is probably gonna be on his way. Chapter 4. Samuel smelled it before he saw anything, not just the smoke from the fires, but the thick, heavy smell. Blood. Death. No. The single word took over his brain. Part of his thinking was automatic, leading him to act with caution, move with stealth. But the front part, the thinking part, hung on to one word: no. He'd made good time, running hard until his lungs seemed to be on fire, then jogging until he got his breath, then back to the full-out run. There was probably another half-hour of daylight before it was too dark to see. As he approached the settlement, he slowed and moved off to the side. It would do no good to run head-on if the attackers were still there. He was silent, listening keenly. Surely, if anyone was still there, they would make some noise. All Samuel heard was the crackling of fire, the soft night sounds of evening birds. No human sound. At the edge of the clearing near his home, he paused, frightened. No, terrified at what he would find. He was hidden in some branches as he studied the area through the leaves to make sure it was clear before he stepped out. The cabin was gone, burned to the ground, side shed and all. Here and there an ember flickered and crackled, and smoke rose into the evening sky, but the building was no more. In the distance he could see that other cabins, scattered through the clearing, had been burned as well. Dreading what he might find, he forced himself to search the ashes, looking for the slightest indication of bodies. He could not bring himself to think about what he was really looking for: his parents. His brain would not allow it. Though he knew the death smell came from someone, he could not allow himself to believe it was from them, from mother and father. He found nothing in the ashes, and when he spread the search out around the cabin, moving in greater circles, he still found no trace that might have been his parents. But as the search loop widened, he began to come across bodies. His neighbors, shot down and hacked where they'd fallen. They did not look like they had been people. What he found seemed more like trash, paper and cloth, blown across the ground. But they were people, friends and families he'd known. A frantic need took him, the thought that the next body might be the one he dreaded most to find, and he ran from one to another, trying to identify them in the failing light. Most had been mutilated so badly it was hard to tell who they had once been. Overton lay by his cabin, his shirt sleeves still not down over his wrists, chest and stomach filled with arrows, his scalp gone, so his face drooped without the top skin to hold it up. Samuel ran from body to body in the gathering twilight until at last there were no more bodies to find. No matter how fast he ran, how wide he ran, he did not find his parents. Along with 6 or 7 others, they had not been killed, or at least had not been killed here. They had been taken away. They had not been killed. He clung to that thought. They had not been killed. So 6 or 7 people are missing, and they can't find their bodies, so they must have been taken. He stood, his breath ragged, sobbing softly. Twice he had thrown up, and the smell and taste mixed with the tears of frustration and grief for his friends and rage for what had been done to them. He knew that if he lived to be 100, he would never lose the taste, the smell, or the images of what he had seen, the madness of what men could do to other men in savage rage. Dark caught him now. He had circled through the settlement and was back at his own cabin, or where it had been. There was nothing left that would furnish light. All of the candles had melted. But he trapped some of the embers that were still glowing and made a campfire off from the cabin a bit. In its light, he found the wood pile, which oddly had not been burned. And at the side of the pile there was a stack of pine pinch knots and roots that his mother had used to start fires. The pinch concentrated in the knots, burned with a smoky hot flame that lasted for an hour or more and would work as a torch. Near the garden plot he found the oak shovel they had used to turn the earth for gardening. The attackers had overlooked it or left it as useless because maybe anything of value had been taken or destroyed. There were 9 bodies to be buried before the coyotes, wolves, and bears came. He knew that he would be moving come daylight, tracking, looking for sign, so the burying had to be done tonight. Carrying spare pine knots and the shovel, he went from body to body. He dug a shallow grave next to each one, knowing that it might not be enough to protect them, that scavengers might dig them up, but so pressed for time that he had no choice. He covered each as best as he could. 3 were children, and did not take as long, and though it was hard to tell exactly who they were in the dark and with the condition of their bodies, he remembered the children laughing and playing in front of the Olafins' cabin, 2 boys and a little girl with a crude doll. He found the doll in the grass and wept as he buried it with the smallest body. He cried over each corpse, thinking of them living, thinking of them meeting in the cabin and living and talking and laughing and just being. And now all gone, gone. He could not stop crying, thinking of his parents, wondering, worrying. It took 5 hours to bury everyone. It was still dark when he finished and looked around him. Then he realized that he should have said something over the bodies. He did not know the right words, something about ashes and dust, but he took another torch and went back to each grave and bowed his head and said, "Please, Lord, take them with you, please." It was all he could think to say, as he hoped it was enough. He went back to the campfire by his own cabin site and sat looking into the flames, praying for safety for his parents and the others who had not been killed, praying for all who survived, but praying most for his parents, and squatting there by the fire, also praying for daylight to come so he could begin to look for them. And in half an hour, a little more, his eyes closed, and sleep came and took him down, down, until he was lying on his side by the fire, sleeping deeply with all the bad dreams that he'd known would come true, sleeping with twitches and jerks and whimpers at first, and then just sleeping. Sleep. That concludes chapter 4. The Americans. The American Army consisted of 3 parts: the Continental or regular Army, the volunteer militia, including the elite Minutemen and the Rangers, or small groups that were trained in guerrilla tactics. The Continentals bore the brunt of the fighting, and they were equipped much like the British, with smooth-bore brown bess muskets and sometimes bayonets. Many of them also carried tomahawks or small axes, which could be very effective once past the first line, the line of bayonets. The militia volunteers were usually used to supplement the Continentals, but were quite often not as dependable or steady as they could have been had they been trained better, and they often evaporated after receiving the first volley and before the bayonets came. And most of them were also issued smooth-bore muskets, and some had bayonets for them, but others had rifles, which were very effective at long range but could not mount bayonets. Special ranger groups, such as Morgan's Rifles, had an effect far past their numbers because of the rifles they carried. A rifle, by definition, had a series of spiral grooves down the side, inside of the barrel, with the low pressure of the black powder. The rifling then was with a slow twist, grooving with a turn of about 1 rotation for 35 or 40 inches. A patched ball was gripped tightly in the bore, and the grooves rifled, and the long bore up to 40 inches enabled a large powder charge, which allowed the ball to achieve a much higher velocity, more than twice than the smooth bores, and the high rate of rotation or spin stabilized the ball's flight, resulting in greater accuracy. So because of the inside spirals in the bore, or the tube that the ball travels down, it could gather a higher velocity while it spun out of the bore and could go farther and hit with more accuracy. but most of them, that's why this small group was the best. The smoother ones, from what I understand, balls just kind of ricocheted in the bores, so when they did shoot out, they didn't go as far, and they were much less reliable. But that concludes chapter 4. And man, that was difficult to read. Ooh, so take notes. I wonder if he has any idea of like who killed them, because arrows and scalping was used, and I'm not sure if that was used by like British soldiers. I mean, it could have been, but I don't know. Tomahawks were carried, but by Continental soldiers. I don't know. I'm interested to see what happens in the next chapter. Don't forget to take notes. And think about like how soon this happened. This was like the day after they received news that there was a war in the first place. So as slow as news travels, apparently the war traveled just as fast. Whew. Bye, guys.